A woman of courage, faith, and sacrifice can greatly impact and change her world. Let me say it again. A woman of courage, faith, and sacrifice can greatly impact and change her world. It is Mother's Day. I speak to all of our ladies today. I'm not speaking to you about necessarily changing the United States or the entire globe. I'm speaking to you about ladies who are of great faith and courage and sacrifice changing their world. That may be 5 people, it may be 500, it may be 5,000, it may be 5 million. The issue is not the scope, but whatever your world is, ladies, I'm telling you, ladies walking in faith and courage and sacrifice can change their world. Let me give you an illustration beginning with a picture that is very familiar and dear to my heart. I want to show you something. This is a picture of my immediate family. It is from my daughter's wedding back in December. Many of you have seen it probably too many times, but that's okay. You'll see it a lot more probably. But I show you this picture. I want to explain to you a story about the extent of courage, of faith, and of sacrifice that took place to have this picture here. Let me explain. In 1993, Ellison was pregnant with Savannah. And on September the 13th, she went into labor. In fact, I was coming back from college. I was coming back from seminary in Atlanta. I was going up there and studying and coming back and forth on Mondays. And I was on my way back. And I got a call on my phone, which I knew was critical because it was one of those big bag phones. It was like $1 a minute, or $3 a minute. Whatever it was very expensive. And so I knew it had to be critical. Found out she had gone into labor and that she was at the Coliseum Hospital. At the time when I got the call, I was on I-475 coming down, and I had a friend with me, that one of my very, very dear friends, and we carpooled together every week. I told him what was going on, and he said, "Man, don't worry about taking me home. Let's just go to the hospital, and we'll figure it out when we get there." And I told Alyssa, from that moment to Coliseum Hospital, I never realized a Mazda Protege could go triple digits. But Pastor Micah, just in case you were wondering, it can. So I got to the Coliseum Hospital, sped there, and then proceeded to wait for the next 30 hours or so. And we got to a point where the baby's heartbeat was dropping. It was Savannah, and they had to wheel Alyssa in for a C-section. Now, we oftentimes refer to a C-section or cesarean, and we refer to it kind of glibly. But let me explain to you who may not be fully appreciative of what that means. That basically means they go in with a knife and cut you from one side of the stomach to the other. And in some cases, they have to cut you vertically too, depending on where the baby is. And they pull a baby out. Men are saying, "Well, Pastor, I've had surgeries." Listen, your 3-millimeter cyst is not the same as having your stomach cut open and a 10-pound baby pulled out. Savannah was 9 pounds and 10 ounces when she was born. Well, you say, "Well, I don't know that particular delivery may not have taken as much courage as did the fact that after a while she was ready to have another baby." And so to having gone through that and to say, I'd like to have another child, and so we did, and she got pregnant with Andrew, went to the OB first time or so, and basically he said, "Look, you've had a C-section once. Basically, we're gonna require that you have another one." Most of the time, they insist on once you've had one, any pregnancies after that, they insist on another C-section. So now she is blessed with the news that for the next 9 months she can think about having her stomach cut open again, when the baby comes. And so I'll never forget, we had the scheduled C-section, which is great. Like for me, it's like, hey, we can show up, but for her, it's a little more difficult. And so I remember leaving Warner Robins and driving I-75 north up to the Coliseum Hospital, and we were passing right about Mercer University, or maybe even Vineville, right in that little section. And I was driving along, and I remember her turning to me and going, "I'm not sure I want to do this." I said, "Baby, we had no choice now. We got to go." And I remember just there was this sense of fear. It was more the anticipation, right? The anticipation of the surgery and the recovery that came after and all that. And so we went and had the C-section. She had that done. Andrew was born. All the recovery that goes in afterwards. And some of you ladies, how many of you ladies have actually had that beautiful experience of a cesarean birth? Yeah, several. So you know what I'm talking about, the post-recovery. The delivery is easier. The recovery is a whole lot more difficult. And so we had Andrew and went on for some years. God placed us down at Ellison Baptist Church in Long County, Georgia. And it was quite a few years. And Alyssa, for several years, felt like, I think we're done having children. And I said, well, I don't think we are, but you know what? I didn't say a lot about it. I just prayed, and we went along. And finally, Alyssa got to the point, she said, you know what? I think I'd like to try to have one more child, along the way. And there's a lot between that, but it kind of came to that as we prayed together. And so she did. And she was 20 weeks pregnant. I was pastoring Ellison Baptist Church. And just a real brief synopsis of a story that's much larger. In fact, a story I've shared with this congregation in one or two sermons. Anyway, at 20 weeks, had serious trouble, and we lost the baby at 20 weeks, which is pretty far along, for that to happen. Kind of walk through that, and I will say this. Some of you may understand that those kinds of things sometimes are the glue that makes marriages. God did some things in our heart through that time that we still look back on, and we see things He did in our relationship with Him, with one another, walking through trials together. Listen, that's marriage. I mean, you say, well, I didn't know it was going to be this hard. What, are you kidding me? That's where you build marriage, is when you're walking through things, and sometimes it means, high volume, lively discussions. It's what we call them. But I'm telling you, all that stuff ends up binding the marriage together. So we walked through that, and it wasn't long afterwards. In my back of my mind, I thought, I really feel like we're still supposed to have another child. But we both just been through trauma together, her in particular. But she came and said, I think I still want to have another child. And so I got to tell you, that statement showed an incredible amount of commitment to her family, to our marriage, to God, and just a great amount of faith and courage. And so almost, not exactly, but almost 1 year after we lost that baby in 2004, she gave birth to Sarah Elizabeth, who's now 12. Now, I thought back on that this week, and this came to my mind. I thought, really, she showed a lot of courage. It really is. Women have babies all the time, but doggone, that's tough. It's a difficult thing to walk through, to experience, and then to want to do it again, and then to go through trauma and heartbreak and still want to do it again. It shows a great amount of faith, shows a great amount of courage, and quite frankly, that picture I showed in just a moment ago, that picture's not there without her courage, without her faith, and without her love for her family. It's just not there. And so you say, well, that's just your family. Yeah, but that's her world. And now all that family is beginning to grow up and go off and influence other people. And one's married, and now she's ministering to other people. And we've got another one about to go off. And now all the people they're impacting can be traced back to the fact that she took steps of courage and faith and sacrifice along the way to make it happen. A woman of courage, faith, and sacrifice can greatly impact and change her world, whether that's 3 people or 3,000 or 3 million. This morning, I want to take a look at just such a lady. If you have your Bibles with you, I want you to turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 2, as we look at Jochebed. Jochebed. You're going to like her name by the time we're done. Jochebed, a woman who changed her world. A woman who changed her world. And we're going to look at Jochebed, and we're going to consider and maybe come to learn for some of you. Some of you already are familiar with Jochebed. In fact, Tuesday morning in our men's prayer meeting, I shared about this passage, about this lady, and a number of our men knew who Jochebed was. And if you don't, you're going to know by the time we're done, and you're going to like her by the time we're done. You may even like her name. Now, I don't know that you're going to name your child after her, but I'm just saying, you're going to like her name. At the end of Genesis, Joseph and Jacob had reunited in Egypt, if you'll recall. And Joseph was the second most powerful man in the world under Pharaoh. And Jacob and all of Joseph's brothers, all of Jacob's sons and their families had resettled in Egypt as a result of the famine. And they began to grow. Now, I know in your Bibles, in my Bible, you'll notice from Genesis to Exodus, there's a little bitty section about 1.5 inches. Maybe in your Bible it ends Genesis one page and goes to Exodus the next page, but there's not much in between. Well, let me just say to you, a lot happened in between Genesis and Exodus. Jacob's family grew enormously in Egypt. And a new Pharaoh, a new ruler, a new emperor came to power. And that emperor came to power, and he did not know Joseph, and he did not know Jacob, and he did not know their God, and he really didn't care one way or another about them. All he was concerned about was this group of people was growing up within his country who were not really native to his nation. He didn't like them. And so he began to put them into slavery and began to mistreat them, hoping that their numbers would not keep growing so much. In fact, at one point, the Pharaoh decided that every boy that was to be born would be put to death. And so they had these midwives who, when a baby was about to be born, they'd rush to the scene. And the Pharaoh told them, ladies, when you get to the scene, you're to put these boys to death. You are to abort them. You are to abort them. And we read the book of Exodus and we think, well, that's horrible that an emperor would command these midwives to abort babies. Well, I don't think I have to do too much explaining for you to understand that that's happening in America today. But nevertheless, the midwives wouldn't do it. Bless their hearts. They had this understanding of God. They said, we ain't doing it. And so Pharaoh called them back in and said, ladies, maybe you didn't understand me. When these boys are being born and you birth them, you choke them, you kill them, I don't care what you do to them, put them to death. And they said, Pharaoh, you don't understand. These Israeli women, these Jewish women, man, they are tough. And we get a call to come deliver the baby, and by the time they get there, bam, that baby's already there. They are hardy women. I don't know how many women like to be called hardy, but I'm just saying. That's what they said about the Jewish women. So he said, well, I'll tell you what. Then I'll just cut it off right at the get-go. I don't care if they're just being born or they're already born. I don't care if they're 2, 3, 4 years old. Firstborn boys, we're going to kill them all. And if girls are born, that's fine. Leave them alone. And so mass genocide of all these little baby Jewish boys was taking place in the nation. Horrible, horrible things. Now, we're more civilized today, so sometimes I don't know that we fully put together the idea that the abortion industry in America is doing the same thing. This is not a message on abortion, but how can I not make the connection, just in case you didn't already? We are murdering unborn babies the same way Pharaoh was murdering boy babies in Egypt. The same way Herod would do later on when Jesus was born. It's an awful thing. How many of you know sometimes the law is immoral? Just because it is the law does not necessarily make it moral. And we could go down the line for a lot of things. So this isn't the only law like that, but it's a direct implication here to what the Pharaoh was doing. Well, that's where we pick up in chapter 2 of Exodus. Here's what we want to look at. We want to look at the steps of a little lady named Jochebed, and we want to consider how her steps would impact all of Israel. Now, when she took her steps, just to clarify, all she was trying to do was take care of her family by faith, with great courage, and sacrificially. Really, all she was just trying to do was take care of her family. Little did she know it would impact an entire nation. I doubt no mother could really know when they're just sacrificially, by faith, with great courage, putting themselves on the line for their little family. And then how do they know that one of those family members isn't going to go off and change the world? So all she was doing in this story we're looking at is taking care of her little brood. And yet in doing it, there are some steps she takes that impacts the whole nation. And so ladies, I want you to hear me. Mothers, grandmothers, ladies, maybe you don't have biological children, but I promise you if you're a member of this church and you're a lady, you have the way our children are raised, you have a direct implication in their lives. You have that at stake. And so let's take a look at what Jochebed did and how her steps would impact all of Israel, beginning in chapter 2, verse 1. And a man of the house of Levi, very important, a man of the house of Levi. That means he had been born out of the tribe of Levi. That means that eventually this man to whom chapter 2, verse 1 is referring, his lineage, his family would eventually become the priestly tribe of Israel. The Levites, the guys who handled the temple, the guys who led worship, a very, very important group of people. In fact, I want to show you something. Hold your place here for just a moment and turn over to Numbers quickly. We're not going to be there long. Numbers chapter 26. Numbers chapter 26, verse 59. Verse 59. The name of Amram's wife was Jochebed. So Amram is the guy that Exodus chapter 2, verse 1 is talking about. The guy who was of the house of Levi. Got that? He married Jochebed, the daughter of Levi. By the way, she was also out of the Levitical tribe. You say they were relatives? Yes. You say that's gross. Not back then. There weren't that many people. Later on, Moses would institute the law, and it would make illegal this marriage, by the way. But prior to the law, it had to be legal. It's kind of like, who did Adam and Eve's children marry? They married their siblings. They had to. There was just a small group of people as time went on. So anyway, my point in bringing this out is both Amram and Jochebed were of the tribe of Levi. They had the Levitical tribe on both sides of their family, and they gave birth to Aaron, Moses, and their sister Miriam. Let me tell you something. If there was ever an all-star group of siblings, this would be it. I mean, she gave birth to Aaron. He would be the first priest of the priestly tribe of Israel, and so would his sons. A couple of his sons did stupid stuff and got killed, but nevertheless, they were going to be the priests. Aaron was an incredibly important man. Not only that, but he would be Moses' speaker. That is, when Moses went to deliver the Israelites from Egypt, Aaron would stand beside him, and he would do the speaking, because Moses said, I can't speak, I stutter, I'm terrible. God said, okay, I'll send Aaron. So that was Aaron. And then, of course, they gave birth to Moses, and Moses, right? He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. If you never did anything else the rest of your life, when you get the first 5 books of the Bible, you write them and they get put in there. That's pretty good. And then Miriam, who was that? She was her sister. In fact, if you go back to the book of Exodus, after God parts the Red Sea, the Israelites come out on the other side. Oh, Miriam steps up and sings a song and gets everybody dancing, and she's just kind of a party girl, but in a good way. And so this was kind of an all-star group of siblings. This is no small thing. But in Exodus chapter 2, verse 1, I got to ask you a question. Do you really think Jochebed knew that? You think she knew all that? Of course not. She had no idea. And so a man of the house of Levi went and took as a wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, I don't know if he was ugly, if she wasn't going to treat him right, but I'm just saying. I'm just joking. Anyway, not really. There's more biblical truth in that than just that bad joke. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. Chapter 2, verse 2. When the law disobeys God, that's where the obedience to the law ends. Where the disobedience to God begins in the law, that's where disobedience to the civil laws end. She was breaking the law by hiding her son. She was violating the Pharaoh's law. You say, yeah, but Pastor, it's a horrible law. Of course it's a horrible law. We got plenty of horrible laws on our books. What do you think, we're exempt in America from that? Of course, we got terrible laws in some places. And so, look, did she know Moses was going to deliver them out of Egypt? Did she know Moses was going to be one of the greatest men in the history of God's people? Well, no. All she knew was she's got a baby boy she just gave birth to, and she will die for him. That's all she knew. It's courage, it's faith, it's sacrifice. So watch this. Here's a first step in a lady who changed her world. It's that she piloted her family with an influential faith. She helped to lead them, to pilot them, if you will. It was an influential faith. Jochebed's faith was so strong, I'm convinced that it was affecting her children long after she was gone. When they were traveling through the wilderness, that 40 years in the wilderness, how much of what she did for them. She won't actually have that much time to spend with Moses, by the way, and that's going to be important later on. Miriam and Aaron are of different ages than Moses. She won't have that much time with Moses, but they'll truck on. And later on, I'm convinced, as they were walking through the desert with the Israelites, having been led out of the nation of Egypt and going through all the difficulty they did, I'm convinced it was so much her impact, her influence. And there's another place where we see this in the New Testament. 2 Timothy chapter 1, don't turn there. 2 Timothy chapter 1, Paul says to Timothy, his son in the faith, I want you to know this great faith I see in you. In fact, watch this. It was a faith that I saw first in your mother and your grandmother. Paul tells Timothy that. Folks, we got 2 books written with Timothy's name on them. And you say, was Timothy important? I don't know, you tell me. If there was a book in the Bible named Joe Hastings, he'd be a pretty important guy, right? I mean, if there was a book in the Bible called Johnny Ellison, I'd say, that's a pretty important guy. So Timothy was this important guy, and yet Paul said it all started with his mother and his grandmother, and long after, listen, Paul meets Timothy, or at least we meet Timothy in Acts chapter 16. Best we can tell, watch this, Timothy is about 16 years old in Acts 16, and then he begins to travel with Paul and do mission work all over the world. I got to be honest with you. In today's world, we often hear guys 25, 26, 28, 30 years old. And they do stupid stuff, and I hear people say, well, you know, he's still young. He's still growing up. I'm like, no. Timothy was 16 years old when he went with Paul, and I realized it was a different world, and I realized they didn't live as long. I realized it was harder, and they matured a little quicker, but come on. Let's stop making excuses for men who are 30 years old still acting like 13-year-olds. That's a Father's Day message, by the way. But Timothy was impacted by his mother and his grandmother. This great influence, the same way Moses and Miriam and Aaron were impacted by Jochebed. So she piloted her family with an influential faith. Ladies, listen to me. The most important thing in your life are those right around you. And God may give you a greater impact. God may give you a wider impact. That's wonderful if you do. Wonderful. This isn't about whether you should work or not work. This isn't about whether you should put your kids in public school or private schools. None of that. It's just that as God leads you wherever you are, that you would pour your life out in your faith there. I promise you, you allowed it to be poured out there. There's no telling how far the implications will go. She piloted her family with an influential faith. Look at verse 3. But when she could no longer hide him, I would think, especially mothers of infants and preschoolers would probably chuckle along with me. You're trying to hide a 2-3-year-old boy who's learned to walk, or however old he was. Maybe just a few months old. Either way, he's loud. And so she couldn't hide him anymore. And she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. Now, many of you are probably thinking, holy cow, that seems a little extreme. I mean, just randomly stick your child in a little boat you made for him, stick him out in the river. Woohoo! Hope it all works out for you, Moses. See you later, right? It's not that at all. Just to be clear, it's not that at all. He was only 3 months old. She put him in an ark, if you will. Not that ark, little bitty ark. She put him in there. And it says she put him down by the reeds in the river bank, so it was an area that would kind of keep him in one place. I know it was a running river, but those reeds stick up out of it, and it would hold him there, kind of catch him on those. And then she stepped back and began to wait. Verse 4, and his sister, Miriam, stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Let me tell you what's happening here. You ready? Not only has she piloted her family with an influential faith over them, she was portraying to her family an incredible faith. Miriam, at least, was seeing what was going on here. She's watching it all and seeing what's happening. And Jochebed is portraying this great faith because, folks, she didn't just toss Moses in the river and flip a coin, hope for the best. No, this thing was planned out. It's like that great balance between saying, I'm going to have every I dotted and every T crossed, but I know ultimately it's God who's going to work this out. It's the parent who says, we're going to pour our lives out, and every day we're going to seek to parent our children to the glory of God, but ultimately we know it's God. Ellison and I learned that long ago. Our children are not really ours, they're God's. And so we pour our lives out daily, hoping to help them to see the Lord, hopefully help them to see Christ. And sometimes it's inconvenient, sometimes it's exhausting, but ultimately knowing that no matter what effort we put out or extend, ultimately they are God's, and we trust Him. And that's what Jochebed was doing. This was not some whim. It was a belief in the sovereignty of God. You know what the sovereignty of God is? It's I believe God is in control of everything. I honestly believe that. I don't just sing about it in songs at church. I don't just acknowledge it in Sunday school classes. I honestly believe that. So when I get into a situation that appears to be out of my control, this looks like that, by the way. When I get into that kind of a situation, I understand. I'm as much as I can dot every I and cross every T, as much as I can take care of every detail, I'm going to. But I know in my heart of hearts, my motive is that it's ultimately God's. Now, we sometimes err on one side or the other. We err on one side of just not caring and not trying and not seeking about the details and not making sure we have everything taken care of. That's one side. That's just sloppy. That's just no effort. And then we err on the other side, where we stress out over every little thing as if every decision, everything we do, everything we step we take, we try to micromanage those children, those people around us in such a way that it's just stifling. And neither is God's plan. We should take every single day, the details, their schooling, their training, what we feed them. I mean, all these things are important. Knowing God's Word, knowing about Christ, watching, all these things are important, but ultimately knowing, but you know what? I know it's God's. And that was Jochebed. She understood the sovereignty. Listen, that's a great word, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. It's a great word, sovereignty of God. He is in control. We are in a place in our lives, listen, where it's such a different season. As our children are beginning to go out and scattered all over the country, literally. By this time next year, we'll have one in Chattanooga, we think, because of what her husband does. I mean, they could be in Missouri next year for all we know. And one in New York. And one at home. And they're scattering out. And people say, oh, what do you think about them just going out so far? I say, you know what? I am thrilled that God has enabled them to pursue their passion of their lives. That's why we raise them. That's why we raise them. They're God's. His sovereignty is such a comforting doctrine. I want to share with you a story from author Paul Jochebed. And he wrote a book called Great Stories Remembered. It is a lengthy story, I will admit. And I debated even sharing it this morning because it is lengthy, but let's talk about the sovereignty of God, ladies. Let's talk about trusting God. My child's moving out in a way that I don't think that's right, ready. I don't think they should do that. And yet they're old enough to say, you know what? But I've got to trust God. It's the sovereignty of God. It's honestly believing He's in control, not me. I'm convinced some parents still think they need to be controlled even when their children are moving up and going out, even as they're getting older. Watch this. It's a story of a guy named Marcel Sternberger. According to the story, he was a methodical man of nearly 50. He was an enthusiastic Hungarian, and he always took the 909 Long Island Railroad train from his suburban home in Woodside, New York, where he caught a subway into the city for work. On the morning of January 10th, 1948, remember that, January 10th, 1948, Stemberger boarded the 909 as usual. En route, he suddenly decided to visit Laszlo Victor, a Hungarian friend who lived in Brooklyn and was ill. At Ozone Park, Sternberger changed to the subway for Brooklyn, went to his friend's house, and stayed until mid-afternoon. He then boarded a Manhattan-bound subway for his Fifth Avenue office. Here is Marcel's words, Marcel Sternberger's own words. I read to you. The car was crowded, and there seemed to be no chance of a seat. But just as I entered, a man sitting by the door suddenly jumped up to leave, and I slipped into the empty place. I've been living in New York long enough to know not to start conversations with strangers. This was in 1948. But being a photographer, I have the peculiar habit of analyzing people's faces, and I was struck by the features of the passenger on my left. He was probably in his late 30s, and when he glanced up, his eyes seemed to have a hurt expression in them, and he was reading a Hungarian language newspaper. Something prompted me to say in Hungarian, I hope you don't mind if I glance at your paper. The man seemed surprised to be addressed in his native language, but he answered politely, you may read it now. I'll have time later on. During the half-hour ride to town, we had quite a conversation. He said his name was Bela Paskin. A law student when World War II began, he had been put into a German labor battalion and sent to the Ukraine. Later, he was captured by the Russians and put to work burying the German dead. After the war, he covered hundreds of miles on foot until he reached his home in Debrecen, a large city in eastern Hungary. I myself knew Debrecen quite well. And when we talked for a while, he told me the rest of his story. When he left Russia after the war, he went to the apartment once occupied by his father, mother, brothers, and sisters. He found strangers living there. Then he went upstairs to the apartment that he and his wife once had. It was also occupied by strangers. None of them had ever heard of his family. As he was leaving, full of sadness, a boy ran after him, calling, Paskin, Baxel, Paskin, Baxel. That means Uncle Paskin. The child was the son of some old neighbors of his. He went to the boy's home and talked to his parents. Your whole family is dead, they told him. The Nazis took them and your wife to Auschwitz. Auschwitz was one of the worst Nazi concentration camps. Paskin gave up all hope. A few days later, too heartsick to remain any longer in Hungary, he set out on foot, stealing across the border after border until he reached Paris. He managed to immigrate to the United States in October 1947, just 3 months before I met him. All the time he had been talking, I kept thinking, somehow his story seemed familiar to me. A young woman who I had met recently at the home of friends had also been from Debrecen. She had been sent to Auschwitz. From there, she had been transferred to work in a German munitions factory. Her relatives had been killed in the gas chambers. Later, she was liberated by the Americans and was brought here in the first boatload of displaced persons in 1946. Her story had moved me so much that I had written down her address and her phone number, intending to invite her to meet my family and thus help relieve the terrible emptiness and loneliness in her life. It seemed impossible that there could be any connection between these two people. But as I neared my station, I fumbled anxiously with my address book. I asked, in what I hoped was a casual voice, "Was your wife's name Mariah?" He turned pale. "Yes," he answered. "How did you know?" He looked as if he were about to faint. I said, "Let's get off the train." I took him by the arm at the next station and led him to a phone booth. He stood there like a man in a trance while I dialed Mariah's phone number. It seemed hours before Mariah Paskin answered. When I heard her voice at last, I told her who I was and asked her to describe her husband. She seemed surprised at the question, but gave me a description. Then I asked her where she had lived in Debrecen, and she told me the address. Asking her to hold the line, I turned to Paskin and said, "Did you and your wife live on such and such a street?" "Yes," Bill exclaimed. He was white as a sheet and trembling. "Try to be calm," I urged him. "Something miraculous is about to happen to you. Here, take this telephone and talk to your wife." He nodded his head in mute bewilderment. His eyes were bright with tears. He took the receiver, listened a moment to his wife's voice, then suddenly cried, "This is Bella! This is Bella!" And he began to mumble hysterically, seeing that the poor fellow was so excited he couldn't even talk coherently. I took the receiver from his shaking hands. "Stay where you are," I told Mariah, who also sounded hysterical. "I am sending your husband to you. We will be there in a few minutes." Bella was crying like a baby, saying over and over again, "It is my wife. I go to my wife." At first I thought I had better accompany Paskin, lest the man should faint from excitement. But I decided that this was a moment in which no stranger should intrude. Putting Paskin in a taxi cab, I directed the driver to take him to Mariah's address, paid the fare, and said goodbye. Bella Paskin's reunion with his wife was a moment so poignant, so electric, with such released emotion that neither he nor Mariah could recall much about it. But Mariah said this, "When I left that phone, I walked to the mirror like a dream to see if my hair had turned gray. The next thing I know, a taxi stops in front of the house, and it is my husband who comes toward me. Details I cannot remember, only this I know. I was happy for the first time in many years." And Deutschman ends it this way: "Was it chance, or did God ride the Brooklyn subway that afternoon?" Sovereignty of God says God had that subway arrive on time, or it arrived. Sovereignty of God says he had Marcel Sternberger go visit a friend, which then brought him back to the subway at a different time he would normally be there. The sovereignty of God says when he walked onto the subway, there was no room to sit anywhere. Oh yeah, the door he happened to walk in on, if you've ever been to the subway, there's multiple doors you can enter. He just happened to enter a door where a guy just happened to stand up from a seat and slip out, where he could just happen to sit right down, which just happened to be by another Hungarian reading a Hungarian language newspaper. The sovereignty of God says that God planned out every one of those details. And folks, listen to me, ladies. The sovereignty of God says that while I pour my life out into pouring it into people around me, ultimately, it's God. She portrayed, Jochebed, that is, She portrayed to her family an incredible faith. Look at verse 5. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." The children they were supposed to be killing. I often wondered what kind of knockdown drag-out there was at Pharaoh's house that night. She brings home this Jewish baby they're supposed to be killing. Or she tells him the story, "You cannot keep that baby." And apparently his little girl wins out. Verse 7. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you?" Gotta love this. "From the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you." And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. This is Aaron's sister totally involved. Watch this. This woman, Jochebed, not only did she pilot her family with this kind of faith, this influential faith, and she portrayed, just living out her life, this trust in the sovereignty of God, right? She portrayed to her family this incredible faith. She planned, watch this, she planned with her family an instinctive faith. All that was happening here was not just by chance. She sat down with Miriam and said, "Listen, Miriam, we've got to do this. I'm going to make a little ark. I can't be near it, but you can be. I'm going to put it in the bulrushes. I just happen to know that Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe, and I happen to know through some friends that she's a very compassionate lady, and she doesn't have a child, and she would love to have a child. That is the rumor around. She's not able to have kids, and so I'm going to leave Moses down there, and then I want you to stand back 27 and a half feet and watch, and when she comes down, when she picks up the baby, you run up in there, and I'm counting on God to compel her care for children, her desire to have children, her compassion for children, to compel her to want to keep him, and then when she picks up the baby, you let her know you can find a nurse for that baby, and this is the plan. Got it? This was no happenstance. She got her daughter involved in this. Don't you know that changed Miriam's life? Oh, well, look, when we plan with our families, when we get them involved in the spiritual decisions, when we talk to them, by the way, when we talk to them about the things we've blown, you know, I messed up here, but God came in. When we talk to them, just everyday things. I remember once when Savannah was young, about 5 years old, one of the first times I recall that, like, she's getting it. We were driving down the road, and we saw a car wrecked over to the side. And from the back seat, she said, "Should we pray for them?" And I was like, okay, she's starting to get it. This religion thing, this faith thing, this isn't a compartment on Sunday morning. It's just a life. We're immersed in it. It penetrates through us. It's our lives. It's what we breathe. It's everywhere we go. It's not a compartment of our lives. It is our lives. And so that's what Jochebed did. She involved her family in this instinctive faith where she said, "You know, I believe God will take care of this." You know what? Here's the thing. If God didn't, something happened to Moses, he was going to die anyway. Somebody was going to kill him. But she knew God. So I think we can work this out, and she made a plan, and she did it with her family. And then watch this, verse 9. And by the way, just a note, ladies, your first plan that you work out with your families is the plan of salvation. That's the first plan you involve your families in. Verse 9. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." You got to love that. This is kind of like the punchline in the whole story. I hope you all are following what's happening here. Jochebed puts her child out there. Pharaoh's daughter picks him up. She's then called to nurse him, and she gets paid for it. And I imagine Pharaoh's daughter paid well. She's paying a lady who was actually one of their slaves. Go figure. Just when you're in a situation where you can't possibly imagine how God would work it out. Folks, I don't know what's going on. Ladies, I don't know what's going on with you. But just when you got in a situation, you cannot possibly imagine how God will work this out with your children, with your grandchildren, with kids you love, people you know. Maybe they're not related, but they're kids you care a lot about. And you just can't imagine how God's going to work this out. And then you get paid to nurse your own child. Go figure. Verse 10, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. Can you imagine? She nursed Moses up until the time it was time for him to stop nursing, and then she brought Moses back to Pharaoh's daughter, knowing Pharaoh's daughter could give him a magnificent education and provide him with all the things she never could. Do you think it broke her heart? You better believe it did. Let me tell you about Jochebed. This was not about her. This is not about how I feel. If you look at the story, she said, this is really not about how I feel about Moses. This is not about how hard it is for me to give him up. It's not about how difficult. It's really what's best for him, even if it tears my heart out to give him back to Pharaoh's daughter, but that's what she did. Final thought in her steps in verses 9 and 10. She prepared for her family with an intentional faith. There was great intentionality about what she did with her child and her children. None of this was happenstance. We'll just figure it out along the way. Some of that's fine, but you better have some spiritual plans. Whether you have plans for college funds and plans for paying for things and plans for paying for braces and all budgeting, all that should be true, but you better have a plan for growing them spiritually. And it certainly should involve church, but it starts long before you get them to church. Listen, folks, a woman of courage, faith, and sacrifice can greatly impact and change her world. There was a lady back at the turn of the 1900s. She was born in 1850. Her name was Annie Walker Armstrong. When she was 20 years old, she accepted Christ as her Savior in Maryland. That's where she was born again. And soon after that, she was then equipped to be a missionary. She had a heart for missions. In 1888, she was 38 years old. She helped to create and launch what was known as the Women's Missionary Union, and the Southern Baptist Convention is now Women on Mission. Some of you may be familiar with that, some of you not, but it is an auxiliary organization of the Southern Baptist Convention that does great work with missions. Annie Armstrong, in her role as head of the organization, folks, this is way back in the late 1800s. She facilitated communication between denominational leaders, local congregations. These were mainly missionaries who were North American missionaries, church planters in America, missionaries to Indians, missionaries to immigrants. Most of her mission work was to these. She would also be kind of the stepping stone for another lady named Lottie Moon. And Annie Armstrong was the first executive director of the Women on Mission, the Women's Missionary Union. It was said that one year she wrote up to 18,000 letters. How do you even do that? Just corresponding with missionaries and congregations to further the efforts. During her tenure as a head of the WMU, she refused a salary. She traveled at her own expense on behalf of the WMU. She personally visited missionaries and served throughout the U.S. And then in 1895, for the first time at Easter, a convention-wide offering was held. All of the money would go into mission efforts in the North American mission field, mainly the American mission, to reach out to the immigrants, to reach out to the Indians, to preach the gospel, to start churches. That Annie Armstrong Easter offering is now almost 125 years old. We do it at Easter. I know some of you see the banners. Many of you know what that is. Some of you don't. Some of you are members of this church. You've never been members of a Southern Baptist church before. Some of you are visitors here. That Annie Armstrong Easter offering, every dime of it goes straight into the mission field. None of it for administrative purposes. None of it for bureaucracy. All of it goes to the missionaries out in the field. Those offerings. One of Annie Armstrong's great enduring quotes. I love this. The future lies all before us. Shall it only be a slight advance upon what we usually do? Ought it not be a bound, a leap forward to altitudes of endeavor and success undreamed of before? Annie Armstrong was not a wife. She was never married, never had children, but she was a woman of God. And she invested her life in the people around her, and look what God did with it. Now, God's not calling every lady to be an Annie Armstrong, but He is calling every lady to pour their lives into the world around them. And I'm just wondering, in your case, Where is that? Who is that? What is that? Maybe it's 2 people, maybe it's 2,000. Maybe it's a group, maybe it's several groups. I don't know, you know, and God knows. And I'm just saying, a woman walking in great faith and courage and sacrifice can change her world. It begins by knowing Christ as your Savior. If you're one of our ladies here today and you've never trusted Christ, that's where it begins. And then it continues as being a part of a fellowship where you can serve, and then beginning to live your life out everywhere you are, at your workplace, at your school. And I don't know where you are on that journey today, but your life is impacting someone, ladies. By God's grace, we'd have ladies of courage and faith and sacrifice that would change their worlds. Pray with me. Father, right now, as we get ready to go into this time of invitation, God, lead us and direct us to obey you in Jesus' name. I'm going to ask all of you just to stand where you are. Just stand right where you are.